Hi, everyone. Welcome to Behind the Couch. It is March 5th. I don't know why I felt like I had to say the date. I never do. But thank you for joining us on this Saturday. I'm Dr. Shiloh, and I am here with my wonderful co-host, person I could not do this without, Dr. Scott. Hello.
Hey, you could probably do it without me. You could just have like a puppet. Just like an annoying sock puppet.
A sock monkey puppet?
Yes, a sock monkey puppet. That's
okay.
Right.
If I ever need a stand-in, we'll definitely just have to go that route.
Perfect.
You know what we should do? I really need to start up doing the Scott takes again and like do video with like sock puppet mouthing it. How funny would that be?
Oh, now you gave the idea away. That's actually really great. Welcome back, everybody. We do not want to waste any more time because we have an amazing guest that we've been trying to get on for quite a while, like at least like 3 or 4 months, right? Just scheduling.
Scheduling. Yeah. But yes, we will get to that. Let's do all of our housekeeping, get that out of the way. And we are going to have a great conversation with Aldo Cimino in just a few minutes.
Who, by the way, has the coolest name ever. That's like a movie star name. I love it.
It is. I'm dying to ask him if it's Sicilian. I'm pretty sure it is. So, all right.
Welcome everybody. We want to welcome our new Patreon members. We got Tiffany D, Mary Lee R, Kristen V, Kelly C. Thank you so much. Again, we're always amazed and honored that people give us their money to help make this project happen. We appreciate it. And thank you for being part of the family.
Yes, and it is going to be going towards us going to CrimeCon and then True Crime Podcast Festival. So, and we committed to the Savannah Crime Expo. So Scott and I have a lot of travel in our future, and grateful to hopefully be able to see more of you around the country, as well as I've been talking back and forth with our tour guide, and we are looking at getting another true crime walking tour in Hollywood put together in the springtime. And of course, our Patreon members will have first dibs on that. So I think this time we're going to let everyone, if they want to, bring just 1+1 to make more room. But Patreon members, and if you're local, you'll get first dibs on that. So another perk for sure to being part of our Patreon tribe. An additional perk is that we put you into a giveaway every month for a piece of merch. So we did not pre-select a piece of merch this time around. So you get to pick what you like off of our website.
Yeah.
I am going to go ahead and spin the wheel here. So many names on this beautiful, colorful wheel. Stop it. Jason Usry. No way. Jason is our winner. Oh my goodness. He just got 2 new onesies for his baby from LA Not So Confidential not that long ago. But yes. Congrats, Jason. Thank you for being a Patreon member since forever. We appreciate you so much. So toggle your butt over to our website and pick something on out to represent us when you're at CrimeCon. That's all I ask, is that you have to wear it at CrimeCon. All right. So speaking of CrimeCon, of course, we're going to be there on Podcast Row. Remember, if you haven't gotten tickets yet, you can still purchase standard badges and get 10% off. I'm sorry, Jason just said he'll wear the onesie.
Perfect.
Please don't do that. You'll look great standing next to Scott in his Las Vegas showgirl outfit. So if you use the code confidential, you can get 10% off your badge, and we would love that. It's not just you get a perk for it, but if they're going to look and see who all uses what codes, and therefore what sort of interest there is in bringing these shows back to CrimeCon in future years. So it's helpful for them to kind of log the interest in who's showing up for who. So truly, truly appreciate it. All right. Anything else, Scott, before
No, I think we are ready to go.
Yeah, let's Aldo, I am going to unlock these boxes. If you can grab one of the spots, I'm going to introduce you to our lovely audience here. Aldo Cimino is an assistant professor, hello, of anthropology at Kent State University. He is among the foremost experts on hazing and has conducted original, experimental, and ethnographic work on the phenomenon, including field work with a hazing fraternity. Cannot wait to hear more about that. But his focus is on furthering a scientific understanding of the motivation to haze and the impact of hazing on hazies. Welcome, sir. How are you?
I'm good. I'm happy to be here. Can you hear me all right? Is everything fine?
We can hear you just fine. Yes.
All right. Good. Yeah. Yeah.
So, Sicilian?
So I'm not Sicilian.
Okay.
My Italian heritage though is certainly firm. I actually forget though the specific, very small regional location from which my Italian side descends from. I always forget the name of it. But
got it. No worries.
I should note though that my last name is pronounced Cimino, like Al Pacino.
Got it. Cimino. Thank you for the correction. Thank you for being here. We so appreciate you reaching out after the episode aired. How did you stumble upon our little show?
I was doing a Google search for something hazing related. I'm always looking for this, that, and the other thing. And I came upon that particular episode that you had done. And I was like, awesome. Let's see what's going on here. Because obviously I'm interested in how the media treats hazing, how sort of podcasts now are treating hazing now that podcasts are part of the media. And I was really impressed. I really appreciated that you took the time to address the phenomenon from so many different angles, that you clearly had done a lot of reading. You named studies that are common citations in the literature. It was just up and down. I thought it was really good. And I wish that more media depictions of hazing were that careful and that thorough.
Well, thank you. We certainly appreciate that. I posted a review on our social media today that we just received on the show, and it was from a clinical psychologist. And I think Scott and I are always very humbled when professionals in the field of psychology or adjacent have positive things to say about the show, because
absolutely.
We put in between our day jobs, we put these episodes together every couple of weeks and feel like there's never enough time to do enough research, and really feel like we're just scratching the surface. However, we still want to make it listenable for people. And that's kind of what we aim for. So how long ago did you leave Santa Barbara for Ohio?
It's because
you've changed schools on us since we decided to.
Yeah, it's a little complex. I was temporarily in Seattle for a while, and then I moved from Seattle as of August. I accepted a position at Kent State University. So prior to that, I was a lecturer at UC Santa Barbara. But now I've moved on to the tenure track, so that I'm now in a much more traditional and formal academic position.
That's great. Congratulations.
Thank you.
So would it be correct to label you as an anthropologist?
Yes.
Or, okay, fantastic.
So technically, I was hired as a cultural anthropologist, though most mainline cultural anthropologists might disavow me.
That means you're our people. We love that even more. That makes you more fascinating. I don't use methods that are popular right now in mainline cultural anthropology, nor popular theoretical frameworks that they would prefer. So it's not that I'm persona non grata or they hiss at me or something. It's just I'm operating using tools that they would prefer not to use.
Got it. Cultural anthropology was one of my most favorite courses I took in undergrad. And I had a moment there of like, do I want to change and go this way? And at Cal State Fullerton, we had one of the foremost experts in forensic anthropology out of our school, and she would take us criminal justice students out to go search for dead bodies in the desert where they had found body parts like the summer before. And I just thought it was the best thing ever. And, she had a bunch of students that were super interested in stumbling upon something like that. So she had a lot of free labor, but fantastic topic and field. And we actually have a lot of people that write us saying that they're studying cultural anthropology and anthropology in general. So I think there's a lot of crossover here. Can you tell us a bit about how you came to be interested in studying hazing?
Yeah, so my interest in hazing really goes all the way back to being an undergrad in college. I really wanted to, I knew at that point that I wanted to go to grad school. I knew that I wanted to be in the behavioral sciences, and I wanted to, in particular, specialize in the evolutionary behavioral sciences, like really searching for ultimate explanations for particular human behaviors. And one of the topics that I started to look into as an undergrad, because I was pursuing an honors thesis, was cognitive dissonance. And so I was trying to think, like, might there be interesting evolutionary reasons why people experience dissonance? Is this sort of a byproduct of the way that our brain works? Or is it something that is operating as designed?
And can you we have some very educated listeners, but can you give a brief one-liner on cognitive dissonance for our audience?
Sure. So as traditionally conceived, cognitive dissonance is the state of discomfort that occurs from holding two cognitions that are inconsistent simultaneously. And so the idea is that because holding two cognitions that are inconsistent simultaneously creates discomfort, you are motivated to modify at least one of those so that they are now consistent. So if, the classic experiment that you guys talked about with respect to hazing had to do with effort justification as cognitive dissonance, right? The idea that when you go through something, it is inconsistent with the fact that you have expended a bunch of effort to recognize that that thing wasn't worth it. So I did all this stuff. It wasn't worth it. These cognitions feel inconsistent. That creates dissonance. Now you have to modify this. Maybe it was worth it. It's wonderful.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
I'm sorry, were you going to?
Yeah,
before Scott asked you, go ahead.
Dissonance, right? I was reading about dissonance, and it was interesting, but it wasn't really grabbing me. But then I came across this really famous experiment from 1959 by Aronson and Mills, which is the effect of a severe initiation on liking for a group. And this is an experiment that you talked about, I believe, in your podcast. It's very famous, and I'll just run through the basics of it. So basically, Aronson and Mills had subjects in their experiment. They told them that they were going to join a discussion group, but that in order to join this discussion group, they had to go through an initiation. And some of them were exposed to an unpleasant initiation, and some of them either had a mild initiation or no initiation at all. And the unpleasant version required people to read erotica out loud to the group that they were joining or thought that they were joining, as well as a bunch of bad words. They had to say all sorts of genitalia words, but in the worst possible way, right? So keep in mind, this is 1959, so people were a little more straight-laced, right? In terms of this being a severe initiation, and all of their subjects were women. This isn't commented on much, but I think it deserves more attention because it's a really strange aspect of their experiment. They want to talk about initiations in the world, but some of the most severe and intense initiations are done by men. Why are all of their subjects women? In any case, They did it with all women, and they had them join a group where after they go through this process, the group itself turns out to be incredibly lame, just the lamest possible group. Like Aronson and Mills talk about how they just try to make it so unbelievably boring, and like everyone in the discussion group is hemming and hawing, and no one is saying anything that makes sense, and they just like really worked hard to make it terrible. And then afterwards, they had their subjects fill out, surveys saying, oh, what do you think of the group members? How much do you like the group, and so on? And it turns out that the participants who went through the unpleasant induction reported liking the group more. So Aronson and Mills said this is evidence that people justify their effort, that this is the manifestation of cognitive dissonance. They went through something that was unpleasant, they experienced the thing, they saw that it sucked, and they were motivated to justify their effort. So I read that and I was like, well, I mean, here's the problem with this experiment. In addition to like whatever sort of methodological critiques one might have, people don't normally join the worst possible group. So this is done to, I understand why they did it, because they want to create as large of a contrast as possible. But the problem is that if a group is really high quality, then, and you go through something challenging for it, there's not much dissonance there.
Right.
So as an explanation for why real world hazing exists, it feels like it's missing a few steps.
Because it didn't really mimic real world experiences or scenarios.
The other thing to keep in mind is that when people have been theorizing about hazing and discussing it and writing about it, and this is something you acknowledge in your podcast, this goes back a century, right? What they've mainly been focusing on are really intense hazing ordeals. Like they're not theorizing about mild annoyances that last for 5 minutes and then end. They're really interested in why are these extreme, lengthy hazing practices happening. And that's exactly what Aronson and Mills didn't do. Like, no one who is working on theories of hazing is working on a theory of mild vexatiousness. Yeah. Right. So in that sense, it's at the very bottom of hazing severity and is potentially misleading. It's like, if you wanted to study the psychological effects of being physically assaulted, you wouldn't poke people with toothpicks and then measure it, right? Like you've got an external validity problem. So that's one of the issues, and the theory itself is weird because if people are motivated to create cognitive dissonance because it has this knock-on positive effect on how people think about the group, that doesn't predict that hazing should end, really. It predicts, in fact, that hazing might be cyclical, that people might go through hazing like once a year, right? Because it's re-upping your commitment to the group and it's making you feel better. Why should hazing have this hard cutoff? So there are regular components of the way that hazing is conducted that are not directly predicted by this theory. It's just sort of like, well, sometimes people over-justify what they go through, which, while generally true in some cases, doesn't directly predict the features of hazing that we see. So I was motivated by this and other things to try to get a better understanding of hazing. And the other thing that I realized is that despite the fact that we have a century of work on hazing, much of that work is descriptive and qualitative, meaning that in terms of the science of hazing, we have maybe, a couple dozen studies at most. And if you think about a lot of other human phenomena that are of broad interest to social psychologists or sociologists, we have hundreds, if not thousands, of studies on all manner of things that are not hazing. So hazing has this tiny, tiny, tiny little trickle of studies, which means that a lot of what we think we know about hazing is not well empirically established. It's a collection of observations, intuitions, and generalizations from small studies that are themselves in question.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So I'm sure that was hugely motivating in how do I move this field of research forward and in what ways? So is that what really wanted you to look at doing ethnographic studies, talking to people face to face, really getting embedded in the culture?
Well, I mean, in fact, it made me want to do experiments first off. Like
sure.
It made me realize that we don't know what's motivating hazing at all. Like when I started doing this, we had no experiments on what would differentially motivate people to haze, at least in a laboratory environment, right? And unlike, the sort of like the trying to measure the effect of these sort of puny hazing ordeals on people, at least in a vignette experiment, you can get people's intuitions about things. Like, how do I feel about newcomers, right? If I imagine that I'm in a particular group, if I'm, reading some description of a group and it says, imagine you're a member, right? Because this is how my experiments often work. You have people come in, they sit down, they read a description of a fictional group, and they're told, hey, imagine you're a member of this group, and it describes what the group does and how they operate and so on. And often I'll modify aspects of that group systematically. So one group of subjects reads about one group, or one modified group, another group reads about another aspect of it. And in both cases, subjects are asked like, hey, you can make any kind of initiation you want. Like it could be really mild, it could be really severe, but this group has decided to have an initiation. They haven't had one before. And what I find is that people who imagine themselves in high quality groups, these high prestige groups, they start creating severe initiations. They start demanding that newcomers undergo unpleasant things. So I was really interested in what can I systematically vary in people's social perception, which will increase or decrease their desire to haze. And that's what I wanted to tackle first. But I also knew that hazing practices in the real world are intensely secretive, and oftentimes the mass of information that we have about hazing is from very old ethnographies, not from modern hazing practices, which are done with a high degree of secrecy, like fraternities and sororities. And when we hear about fraternity and sorority hazing, it's usually decontextualized. So we'll hear about a particular ordeal. So in your podcast, you talked about the sorority hazing that involved, sitting on a a washing machine.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it would sort of jiggle the fat in their body, and they would circle the things that jiggle. Right. Now that's a description of an ordeal, but it's also decontextualized. Like, what actually led to that moment? And I wanted to understand how fraternities in particular were structuring their hazing. What did it actually look like? So I managed to. So first of all, if you want to do this work, fraternities are not going to let you watch them.
No kidding, really?
Yeah,
what a surprise!
So there were people who told me that was like, oh, you should pledge a fraternity without telling them that you're a researcher, but that is actually an ethical violation by IRB protocols. So we can't do that. So I went around trying to talk to fraternity members to convince them that against their better judgment, they should just let me watch them do their incredibly secretive things that are potentially illegal. And needless to say, that was not received well.
It's such a good idea, though. They should have let you.
It's for science. Come on.
But I lucked out, and I lucked out in that there was a particular member of a particular fraternity that I call Alpha. It's a pseudonym, obviously.
Sure.
That decided that they trusted me, and there was one member of Alpha who had a little bit of exposure to me in a different context, and I think that predisposed him to think, you know what, maybe Aldo is legit. So I was able to convince them to allow me to see at least this initial part of their induction process, because they have this 10-week induction where once you enter this induction process as a pledge, it takes maybe 8 to 10 weeks to get through it all. And what seemed to be the case is that they were going to allow me to observe the first couple weeks of this process. And in exchange, I would pay them money, like a monthly stipend. That would be a donation to their chapter. This is how anthropology always works, by the way. Like when you hear about anthropologists hanging out with some culture or subculture, it's not for free. There's always a quid pro quo.
Got it.
Like these some people living in the forest are not going to be like, yes, please, random white guy, hang out with us, right?
This is really good to know. That would never have occurred to me.
Just things you don't think about, but makes sense.
So I'm paying them to deal with my presence, because I'm there hanging out in the corner being like, what does that mean? He just said a term I don't understand, right? So I got them to at least initially trust me, and then after a couple weeks, they were like, all right, Aldo, you have to stop. Like, the hazing is about to kick into gear, and like things are about to get real, right? And so we're gonna cut you off. And I made my case though. I was like, so, you have these pledges, you have these actives. So actives are present fraternity members versus alumni, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I'm actually the only one in this room that has signed a contract saying that I will never reveal who you are or what you've done in relation to that. So like, I am the most trustworthy person here, because any pledge could de-pledge at any moment and then go on Facebook and be like, oh, by the way, I'm being hazed, right?
Yeah, true. You had a contract.
Whereas I'm contractually and ethically bound not to. Because when you're an anthropologist and you do field work, your first duty is to the protection of the population that you're studying.
Sure.
So they were like, all right. So after that little monologue, they were like, all right, let's give this a shot. And I got to watch as things kicked into high gear. And the way that Alpha did their hazing is super interesting. So first, you need to understand like the substrate of it. Like, so what exactly was hazing for them? It was a lot of calisthenics. It's like push-ups, sit-ups, high knees. Sometimes they would go on long runs. There's certain exercises that I'm actually forbidden from specifically identifying. It's not because they're like sexual abuse or something, but they just have particular ritual forms attached to them that could identify the group.
Got it.
They want to retain their creative license for those.
So they do these really intense exercises. Now, they also have you eat really unpleasant, like nauseous food substances that I'm also forbidden from identifying. But needless to say, think about like foods that you could eat en masse that would cause you to feel profound nausea and vomit. So they use that. There are also like a lot of particular ordeals that are only done once, and that might show up or might not show up depending on who in the fraternity is in charge of running the whole process for that pledge class. But that's the basic substrate. Is mostly it's intense calisthenics and or ingesting nauseating substances.
And
so,
may I ask, did you find that this could be changed up by new active members each year when they did pledging, or was this, some super secret alpha Bible that had been there for decades that they're doing the same thing over and over again? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so my anthropologists normally have a primary informant. That is someone that they talk to the most, that they have a good rapport with. Because remember, like groups of people are like anyone, not everyone has the same opinion of the anthropologist, right? Some people are like, F that guy, I'm not interested in talking to him. And some people are like, oh, the anthropologist, what's going on? So my primary informant tells me that Alpha has no official written version of their process. It's orally transmitted. That's probably for the better, given what they're doing. They don't want to write it down. But there is what's called a pledge book. And the pledge book is given to every pledge, and it contains information that every pledge has to know. Things like past presidents, the other chapters that exist in the fraternity creed, fraternity songs, certain mottos and slogans. These are things that pledges must learn. Now, does that answer your question?
Yeah. It sounds like there's some tradition to it. It's not written. But like you said, there are some rituals or acts that could be brought up any given year, but not necessarily.
Yeah.
It's also
there's some wiggle room there.
Having worked in state correctional facilities, that is when someone's being jumped into a gang on the prison yard, you have an encyclopedic Bible that you have to memorize, which is about all the rules. You have to be able to repeat it back. Part of it is knowing kill versus injure points, but they have to. It's like, but at that point, it's a matter of life or death. They have to have that memorized within a certain amount of time.
Yeah. So, earlier I was talking about like the difference between talking about an ordeal and talking about its context, right? So I was talking about, all right, those are the ordeals, but what's the context? Because in principle, the way that hazing could be set up is, pledges walk into a room and the actives go, so today you're doing these things, do them. Right, they could just be like, you're gonna do this many push-ups, you're gonna eat all this weird crap, and then you'll be done once that's all done, and then you go home, right? Because remember, like there are multiple different hazing events, and they happen at multiple times in the week. But that's not what happens. Instead, what happens is the pledges are routinely tested on their knowledge of the pledge book. So they come in and they go, all right, you need to tell me who was the second president of this particular chapter. You need to recite the creed. You need to do these things, right? And if a pledge messes it up, now you're being hazed. However, now you might be thinking, all right, but if they do well, wouldn't that mean they're not being hazed? Like, wouldn't that be an out? Like if you're really book smart, you learn your pledge book, what's the issue? Bam, you're not being hazed. Well, I wrote a paper on this. It's called Planned Failure. And what the actives do is they set it up so it's nearly impossible to succeed. So first, they have all these different standards about how you recite the answers. You have to say it loudly and clearly. You can't mispronounce any word. And depending on how far you are into the hazing process, that is how many weeks have happened, you need to address actives with honorifics like Mr. If you don't use the right honorific, then the answer is wrong. Also, you might be sleep deprived if you're a pledge. You might be in the throes of pain. You might be nauseated. So even if you know the answer to a question, it might not be quickly forthcoming. you're sort of out of sorts and you're trying to generate the answer, and they're like, come on, where's the answer? Where is it? Where is it? Where is it? And then you don't get it, and then suddenly you're being hazed more. So planned failure is the major fulcrum for hazing. It is failure that is the ordeal context. Like, it is almost everything that pledges went through it, at least in alpha, had a kind of failure framing to it. And what I was able to do is find other historical, scholarly and non-scholarly accounts of fraternity hazing, and I was able to find indications of planned failure throughout the United States. So this does not appear to be something that is just unique to alpha. It appears to be like part of the heartbeat of fraternity inductions.
Well, it makes sense that they would sort of have this very concrete mission that you think you have to do, memorizing all of this information. Yet we're going to test you and make it incredibly subjective by it's not loud enough, it wasn't said the right way, all of those things. So no matter what, there's not going to be the one guy that's doing perfect and gets to slide by. So sounds like the Police Academy when I went through that. Oh man, wow, great stuff. Go ahead, please.
So I studied alpha for maybe 22 months, like approximately a year, and that's how I generated that paper on planned failure. And I tried to be like, hey, all these descriptions that we have of fraternity hazing are somewhat non-systematic, and we need to start thinking about the context for ordeals. And hey, I think I've identified this context that can be applied across a number of different fraternity hazing processes. So it's a descriptive qualitative paper, but it's in the service of a truer foundation for scientific work on hazing. Mm-hmm. And there's one other aspect to my fieldwork. So there's one other fraternity that I convinced to let me study them. And now this fraternity I'll call Beta. They were not cool with having me present. They didn't want me to see anything, but I wanted to understand how the hazing process was impacting their pledges. So I was able to build a rapport with a particular member of Beta, and through him and his discussions with other members of Beta and my further discussions with them, I convinced them to allow me to do a longitudinal survey study where I had, at multiple time points, I had pledges in their hazing process fill out psychological surveys of like, how are you feeling at various points? So I had them fill out measures of social cohesion, like how good do they feel about their fellow pledges? How do they feel about the actives? How do they feel about the chapter? And I also had measures of how tough and unpleasant the process was, and separately measures of how fun and enjoyable it is. Because even in fraternity hazing processes, there can be these interludes where like, all right, you've gone through these two hazing ordeals that happened on different days during the week, but on Friday, the fraternity's holding a party and the pledges are allowed to attend. So you have this interlude of like, oh, we're having fun, we can't wear letters and we gotta potentially clean up after everyone, right? But we can at least attend this party and have fun. And also some activities that fraternities do are just straightforward, like they're not hazing. You're just, hey, let me teach you about the history of this chapter, right? So yeah, I did I guess this was, again, approximately 2 years worth of data gathering with about 126 pledges in total.
Wow.
And I've got a paper under review where myself and my co-author do a big stat analysis on trying to see to what extent our measure of hazing or just fun stuff actually predicts how people feel about the group. Like, does hazing actually generate solidarity? Because that's one of the most common theories, right?
So with that 2.5 years of data collection, was that what, 2 classes of new, I wanted to say inductees. This is not the Grammy Museum. Yes, into pledges. So did you get through 2 classes?
6 of them.
6? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Wow, that's great. So that's going to be a wonderful paper to look at. I mean, being able to take surveys and gather data in that way, and kind of looking at the experience that you got to at least live through with them for a number of weeks is going to be really interesting to look at those, even if they're totally different fraternities. So I was telling you earlier that after our episode aired, we got some feedback from some worried parents, of course, even those of us who have children who are small and aren't worried about this yet, but now it's like, oof, I know more about this than I probably want to. Tell me your thoughts on the sort of current anti-hazing approaches, whether it's universities or sort of other entities out there, because I know, military and some of those other groups are also trying to get into that. But I know most of your work is with fraternities.
Yeah, though I am interested in hazing globally. Like I specialize in fraternities because they're right there.
Sure. Yeah.
But yeah, I'm interested in hazing as a human phenomenon. So, all right. I wrote a paper in 2020 called Embrace and Reform, which deals with that very question, which is, what's going on with anti-hazing advocacy and why has it been such a failure? Because one of the things to keep in mind is that anti-hazing advocates have been at this for decades now. And in particular, collegiate hazing. That's really what I want to focus on, because that's where most of their attention has been directed. And that's also where we've seen the most hazing deaths. It's really collegiate hazing, and in particular, fraternities. So anti-hazing advocates have been, running various anti-hazing programs. They'll, bring in anti-hazing speakers who will give, inspiring speeches about hazing. They will have various, anti-hazing week or whatever, where everyone wears pins, like these hands don't haze and stuff, right?
Yeah.
Like they try all kinds of messages, and it doesn't appear to have done anything. And the reason why we think it hasn't done much of anything is because large-scale survey studies done on collegiate hazing suggest that it is incredibly common still, and still very, very common inside fraternities and sororities. I think the 2008 paper by Alan, which was mentioned in your podcast, had it at something like 75% of Greek letter members had been hazed. So, if that's success, I would hate to see failure, right?
Yeah.
Like this is not a sign of a healthy set of prevention programs that are working. But it hasn't seemed to have stopped and made people think like, well, maybe our abstinence only program for hazing is actually not feasible. At least at a collegiate level. I want to be careful about the way that I talk about this, because Embrace and Reform is really about fraternity and sorority hazing. And there are specific properties of these groups, because they are private social clubs, that insulate them against certain types of criticisms. So for example, if we were to talk about hazing in the workplace, which would include the military, by the way, we are talking about people that are selling their labor and trying to survive. They're not necessarily there just because they want to chill with a bunch of cool friends.
Right.
This is, and if we're talking about the United States in particular, they may depend on their employer for healthcare itself. Putting food on the table. The reason why we have all these labor laws and at least some protections for workers is because we understand that sphere of activity needs to be protected due to its necessity. And even if people were super eager to engage in hazing in workplace environments, where it does exist, by the way, I would be formally against it regardless of how carefully it was done. Mm-hmm. So I just want to be clear that we are now focusing in on fraternity and sorority hazing.
Yep.
All right. So we have these private social clubs that are absolutely determined to haze. It doesn't matter if hazing's illegal, doesn't matter if it's against university policy, doesn't matter if it's against their national organization, doesn't matter if people tell them it's evil and bad and wrong, they're going to keep doing it. So what do we do about that? Well, if we take a harm reduction approach, the same kind that has been done with things like the drug war, right? Where we try to think about like, well, all right, is there a way that people could do this that would tamp down on a lot of the issues that we're looking at? And if we think about the variety of different hazing ordeals that exist out there, they vary greatly in their safety margins. Like if you want people to do push-ups, that has really good safety margins. Like however unpleasant it is, it's not that it's impossible to kill someone with push-ups, it's just really hard unless you have extreme extenuating circumstances, right? So that's a hazing ordeal that is much safer than we're going to get you so drunk that you're on the edge of alcohol poisoning, right? One of the things you mentioned in your podcast is that when we do see hazing deaths, alcohol is almost always involved. Sometimes it is the direct cause of death. They're just, pledges are made to drink so much, they just die of alcohol poisoning. So if you think about it this way, then there are things that fraternities and sororities are doing which have good safety margins, and there are things that they are doing which have terrible safety margins. And if you can convince them to switch out the terrible safety margin ones for the good safety margin ones, you are going to reduce the overall harm of hazing. And that is what I think we ought to investigate. Now, when I say investigate, I don't mean implement just because I said so. I mean actually do pilot studies with groups where we are doing things like I did with Beta, where we're taking surveys, we're evaluating the safety, we're evaluating, we're using standard psychological batteries. And also, along with this, I would have fraternity and sorority members have mandated Red Cross first aid training. So not only able to bandage a wound, but also they can spot heat stroke, right? Like they can spot hypoglycemia. They go, because if people are going to do a lot of exercises, because that's where we have the higher safety margins, then you might have people that are getting really tired that need water. You might have people that are diabetic. You need that first aid background. So if we get, and these organizations have plenty of money to send these people to basic first aid training. So first aid training, actually doing safer things. And most importantly, here's the final component, informed consent.
Ooh.
So up front, they need to tell them, hey, this is really going to be a challenging process. Here are some of the things that we're going to require of you. It's going to require calisthenics. It's going to be really intense. It's going to be potentially a little bit like boot camp. You might get yelled at. You're going to have to clean things. You're going to do unskilled labor. Your life will never be in danger, but you have to understand that this is not easy. And before you do this, you have to understand that you're consenting to this, right? And we allow people in the United States to consent to jump out of planes, right? As long as they're adults and they understand what they are doing, we allow that. And so that would need to be upfront before the actual pressured situation starts, right? Because hazing can involve a lot of pressure.
So what are you thinking the informed consent will do? Will it weed out people that are okay, now that I know that this is part of it, I'm out? Or does it make the fraternity more responsible to really hold to some of these other measures too? Or something else? Okay.
Both. Yeah, I mean, and informed consent is a critical component just because hazing is a stressor. Hazing is really intense. Humans can decide to expose one another as long as they're consenting to all manner of bizarre activities. I mean, people in the BDSM community do, right?
Sure.
And most people, at least in the United States, have no problem with that as long as they're consenting, right?
Right.
So These are adults that we're talking about, however young, and our society has decided that 18-year-olds can decide to go to war and die. And so it would be weird if they have the ability to go to war to die, and they don't have the ability to consent to do push-ups and housework. Like, why not? Like, as long as they're not pressured into it, as long as they're genuinely told, hey, this is the challenge, this is what you're going to go through, why not?
I love that you use that particular example, Aldo, because in your wonderful paper that you provided to us, and thank you for that, you give the example of how there's just this almost direct dovetail or parallel to what military training is like with the calisthenics. I mean, that's a perfect example of what is required of them, just in a completely different context.
Yeah. Yeah, and note that no one, at least that I can see, is terrified that we're giving people in boot camp PTSD.
Yes.
Right. Because they're signing up for it, right?
Right. They're signing up for it, and we also trust that there's been some basic level of training in the people that are conducting it, right? Which is why I want to get some first aid training in there. It's people. It seems like there are ways in which people are selectively concerned about things. Like, we have talked our way into a corner about hazing by focusing on the worst possible examples of it, when there are instances of it that are bad, but are just not that bad. And if we know that the people can operate in that realm, then we can push them just a little bit further and potentially make things safer. And one of the things that I found, and this is only subjective, this is qualitative evidence, this is non-systematic, but in my observations and discussions with fraternity members, they often treat hazing ordeals as fungible. That is, one hazing ordeal could in principle be exchanged for another. So, if there were, for example, a member who was allergic to the food that you were trying to feed him as part of the ordeal, they wouldn't be like, well, okay, I guess you can't join our fraternity. They'd be like, oh, well, all right, why don't you do this many push-ups then? So they're exchanging the dysphoria associated with that with the dysphoria associated with something else. And if these ordeals are fungible in that way, then that suggests that this might, again, be a pathway towards harm reduction.
Well, that's interesting, because that's a little similar to the example I gave in the episode, where my boyfriend at the time was a criminal justice major. And so then they said, okay, you don't have to do that illegal thing. We have something else for you to do instead, because we know you want to get hired by a police agency one day or whatever. So it's there, they're open to that. But I think the harm reduction is something that definitely popped in my head as I was sort of structuring what we were going to talk about today, because you're thinking, okay, these are problematic behaviors involving young adults. Where else have we seen this? Teen pregnancy, the drug use, the abstinence does not work. And so I, as a psychologist, I think that's a beautiful route to go, because we have some other areas we can kind of turn to and say, on a large scale, we've seen how this has actually made a big impact in reducing these harmful behaviors. Wow.
Yeah, I'm really excited about the idea of testing this and studying it thoroughly. But I can tell you that I'm in a very tough place. State after state is passing even tougher anti-hazing laws. Universities have really strong policies against it. Everyone is making it not only really hard for people to investigate alternatives to just utter prohibition, but also just harder and harder to study this phenomenon. We're trying to clamp down on something we don't quite understand yet, and that's a problem unto itself. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and that's something you beautifully outline in your paper, is that attempts to repress this phenomenon only make it worse, and only make it more below the surface and harder to address and harder to educate people about. It's that's the whole first part of your paper that is so beautiful about just saying that it's this. You drew an analogy to the just say no, which was an utter failure in the war on drugs, quote unquote.
Yeah. You can find, I was talking about the fungibility between ordeals that are dysphoric, but when you read anti-hazing advocates talk about this, they go, why don't you replace these ordeals with movie nights? Like, why don't you just go have fun?
How sweet is that?
It's sort of like, in abstinence education, if you're like, well, instead of having sex, why don't you just hold hands?
Yeah.
Why don't you just
watch
go
a
have
movie
fun together? There are other ways to show that you like one another.
Yes, the sexual need is not being met. So how do you meet the sexual need? That's what we need to focus on.
Which, to be clear, I'm not saying that people have a perfectly analogous hazing need. I'm just saying that in both cases, there is a disconnect between like what people are doing and why, and the proposed solution. It doesn't appear as though people think that happy, fun activities scratch the same itch for them that hazing does. And if we want safer alternatives, we have to look for things that also scratch that itch.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I just wanted to say also, this has been going on in the chat because we have some really interesting comments being made, that there is this concept of power differential as well among people who, yes, they are technically adults because they've hit the chronological marker, but they are very much driven by organic processes and power dynamics, power differentials. And, I went to a small liberal arts college in the South for my undergrad, and I wasn't in the Greek system, but I do remember a couple of the frats, and it was like Lord of the Flies. I mean, there were people who were in charge and no one dared cross them. And it's all I could remember, thinking was like, how is it appropriate for a 19-year-old to have so much power over someone that is just maybe 9 to 12 months younger than them?
Fascinating stuff.
I mean, are you did you want me to comment on that, or?
I would love for you to. Like, there's so many things. Like, we could have you here for another 2 hours because there's so much information we'd love to get out of you. But yeah.
So I think there's two aspects to your comment as I see it. Like, one has to do with just the existence of power differentials itself, like the idea that there are people inside these organizations that have a sort of miniature version of authoritarian control. And then the other aspect of your comment has to do with pairing that with adolescence, broadly defined, right? Maybe the lack of judgment, or at least the decrement in judgment that we might associate with people that are not fully mature, right? I think that those concerns, especially in the context of hazing, are fully legitimate. Like, I share them. I think that where the reason why I've sort of arrived at this point is not because I think it will stop all harms. It's because I think it's the only tool we have left.
Yeah. That makes sense.
But I just want to be clear, though, that I'm validating what you're saying. There are real concerns. It doesn't just go away because we give them for state training or we fungible these ordeals or what have you. Like, there are things that could still go wrong, and to a certain extent, I think we have to live with that possibility. Like, we have to live with the fact that people want to do these things for better or for worse.
Would there be any advantage to educating parents? Like, information for parents. If you're thinking of sending your kid here, this is a reality of what goes on. How would that, how would you operationalize that? Or do you have ideas about that?
I mean, I do have ideas, but as with Embrace and Reform, I want to be clear that I'm suggesting studies rather than telling people to implement this. I think that one of the issues with past anti-hazing advocacy is that people just thought of ideas and started doing them. But, one of the things that we've learned from past studies of psychological interventions is that they're not all neutral to positive. Some of them can be negative, right? Can actually backfire. So we have to be careful in just saying, oh yeah, I'm a researcher and I know about this stuff, so do what just popped into my head, right? But in terms of parental advice, what I would do is sit down and have the safety margin talk, like where you go, look, if these guys want you to drink or want you to take a different intoxicant, understand that this is how people die, right? And you need to get out of there. Now, if you might not be able to extricate yourself from a particular situation, maybe it's really intense, but what you can say is, for example, you're on medication that interacts with alcohol or what have you. Like, you can have a pre-prepared excuse for why you cannot do that, but then afterwards you ought to leave. That alcohol and substitute intoxicants are the #1 danger here. Now, even with that said, if I were writing advice for parents, I would try to qualify this though. Like, there are a handful of deaths on average related to hazing every year, but hazing is happening a ton. There's a ton of it. And that's because hazers are really not trying to kill anyone. So what you're seeing is instances of profound negligence, not typical things. Like, it isn't as though hazing processes are just shooting out tombstones, right? That's not normally what happens. But with respect to the process, like, pay attention to alcohol, understand that these people that are having you do that don't know your alcohol tolerance. They can't dose this accurately to bring you to a point where you're not happy, but you're not dead.
Yeah. Well, there's so many factors, and thank you for taking the time tonight to highlight how different university fraternities and sororities are from all the other types of hazing that we talked about in our episode and touched on a little bit tonight, because I think there are so many factors. Like you said, it's not somewhere you're going to earn a paycheck. There's a huge social component. And yes, we are talking about people with not fully formed frontal lobes. There's just so much that makes that unique population so different, and has to be related to the fact that that's where we do see the deaths and the lack of judgment and things that lead to that. So what's next for you? Where do you find your research really taking you at this point?
Well, so I mentioned that I've got that paper that's under review.
Right.
I've got another paper that's doing an entirely different analysis on that same data set. So I'm gonna try to figure out whether hazing is actually selecting out less committed members, which, as you know, is a common theory. I have another study that's based on a sample of something like, I think, don't quote me on this, but because I'm working with a couple co-authors and this is their sample, but I think it's based on over 10,000 fraternity and sorority members. Wow. And we are testing some of my theoretical ideas about what predicts hazing motivation. So we had them do various surveys, and we have various measures of things, and my particular theory predicts certain relationships, and we're going to see how that goes. And then beyond that, I'm going to do more studies that look at what predicts hazing motivation, but I'm also planning eventually to try to get a grant to study the hormonal foundations of hazing, like the role of testosterone and cortisol.
Yes.
And to what extent those things mediate or regulate hazing behaviors.
Fantastic. Well, please let us know. I know that can be quite a process and takes time, but let us know when some of those are done. We'd love to have you come back and talk about the outcomes of those papers. So thank you we can't thank you enough for your time. I mean, literally, we
And
didn't even get
for
to,
reaching
like,
out
half
all
of
of this
questions.
time. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you
Yes.
so much for having me. Also, I hope I didn't talk over you guys this whole time. I was just like talking and talking and talking. So
That's the
I
point.
sincerely appreciate being here. I think you guys are doing a great job.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Aldo, for being here. We appreciate your time. And everyone else, thank you for having a lot of comments and feedback in the chat. I want to go back and kind of look through this a little bit. We will have this up on YouTube probably in a couple weeks at the most. So feel free, Aldo, to share this with anyone that think might be interested in this little casual chat here. And to everyone else, have a great night, have a great weekend. Scott, take care. We'll see you later, and we'll see you guys next time. Thanks.
See y'all.
Bye. Thank you, Aldo.